A wealthy millionaire decided to force his daughter into marriage with the humble gardener as a punishment. But in the end, he was taken aback by her response. Thomas Fletcher sat in his office staring out the window. The sprawling Napa Valley vineyard stretched out endlessly, visible through the glass, while the golden afternoon light bathed the hills. Yet, despite the tranquil view, Thomas' mind was far from calm. His daughter Sophia had gone too far again. The reports from his private investigator were spread out on his desk, clearly detailing her most recent act of defiance. Sophia was involved with a troublemaker, some rebellious good-for-nothing from Los Angeles who seemed to thrive on causing chaos. Thomas' jaw tightened. He had given her everything: wealth, the finest education, and countless opportunities, and this was how she repaid him. He had tried to reason with her, but Sophia had always been strong-willed. She constantly tested every boundary he set. After his wife passed away, Thomas had taken it upon himself to control every aspect of Sophia's life. He believed it was the only way to shield her from the dangers lurking outside their luxurious estate. But now it seemed his control was slipping. This wasn't just about a boy anymore. It was about respect. Thomas couldn't stand the thought of Sophia throwing away her future for a fleeting romance with a man who had no ambition. He knew he had to teach her a lesson, one she wouldn't easily forget. A dark thought formed in his mind, and with it a plan, an extreme one, that would force Sophia to rethink her choices. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew well. "Ethan, I need to talk to you," Thomas said once the line connected. Ethan, the family gardener, had been with them for years. He was as reliable as the sunrise, tending to the estate's vineyards and gardens with quiet dedication. A simple man, Ethan was content with his modest pay and the satisfaction of a job done well. Now, however, he was about to become a piece in Thomas's game. A few minutes later, Ethan arrived at the office, knocking lightly on the door frame before stepping in and removing his cap, out of respect as always. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Fletcher?" he asked politely, though his voice held a hint of caution. Thomas studied him. Ethan was in his early 30s, rugged from years of hard labor in the sun. His calm demeanor was the opposite of the chaos Thomas's daughter often stirred up. He was everything Sophia despised: unambitious, humble, and uninterested in a life of luxury. But that was exactly why Thomas had chosen him for his plan. "Yes, Ethan, I have a proposal for you," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "It involves my daughter, Sophia." Ethan's expression shifted, a frown forming as confusion spread across his face. "Sophia?" he echoed. Thomas nodded, his eyes narrowing. "You've noticed her behavior, I'm sure. She's been reckless, making decisions that could destroy her future. I can't allow that." Ethan remained quiet, his frown deepening. He knew Sophia, everyone at the estate did. She was beautiful, smart, and strong-willed, but also quick to show her displeasure. "I need her to learn responsibility, Ethan," Thomas continued, his voice steady. "She needs to understand that life isn't just about indulgence and rebellion." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused. "So, I've decided she will marry you." The room went still. Ethan stared, seemingly unable to process the words. "Marry me?" he repeated, his disbelief clear. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice firm. "You're a good man, hardworking and dependable. You're everything Sophia needs to learn. She'll see firsthand what life is like for those who aren't handed everything on a silver platter." Thomas paused for a moment, his tone softening. "And you'll be compensated, of course." Ethan's expression was unreadable as he stared back at Thomas. "But sir, I'm just the gardener. Sophia doesn't even like me. This doesn't feel right." Thomas waved a hand dismissively. "It's not about like Ethan. It's about discipline. You'll be doing her a favor in the end. She needs to grow up and you'll help her do that." A heavy silence settled between them, and Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze drifting toward the window, as if the vineyards might somehow offer an escape from this strange situation. "I don't know, Mr. Fletcher," Ethan began, but Thomas cut him off. "You don't have a choice," he said firmly. "Neither of you do." Ethan lowered his gaze, understanding there was no point in arguing. Once Thomas made up his mind, there was no changing it. That evening, Sophia came home after a day out in the city. She walked through the grand entrance of the mansion, her heels clicking on the marble floors, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Thomas was waiting for her in the drawing room, sitting with an air of authority that immediately signaled something was wrong. "Sophia," he called as she walked past. She sighed, already feeling the frustration building. "What now, Dad?" she asked. "I'm not in the mood for another one of your lectures." Thomas stood, his gaze unwavering. "There won't be any more lectures, Sophia. You've made your choices and now you'll face the consequences." Sophia raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. "What are you talking about?" "You're getting married," Thomas said, his voice calm but resolute. "Married?" Sophia blinked, her confusion turning into shock. "To who?" "To Ethan, the gardener," Thomas replied, his eyes locking with hers. Her surprise quickly turned to fury. "What? Are you out of your mind? You can't be serious." "I'm very serious, Sophia," Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The wedding is in 2 days. You will marry Ethan, and maybe then you'll learn what it means to live in the real world." The next 2 days before the wedding were a blur of disbelief and anger for Sophia. She tried everything to change her father's mind. Pleading, arguing, even threatening to run away, but nothing worked. Her father had made his decision, and no one dared to stand in his way. Thomas Fletcher was a man of absolute control, and this was just another way he ruled her life, dictating her every move. Sophia stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection with a sense of disbelief. The white dress she wore was simple, nothing like the extravagant wedding gown she had once dreamed of wearing. Her hair was neatly pinned up, yet there was no sparkle of excitement in her eyes, the kind that any bride should feel on her wedding day. Instead, there was an empty, overwhelming dread. "I can't believe this is happening," she murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. Her reflection looked back at her, unmoved, emotionless. Outside, the sun beamed brightly, casting a perfect light over the expansive Fletcher estate, ideal for a picturesque wedding in the lush gardens. But to Sophia it might as well have been raining. She felt like a prisoner, trapped in her own life, forced into a marriage that felt more like a punishment than a celebration. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Of course it was her father, coming to ensure she hadn't changed her mind or tried to escape. Thomas's voice was stern when he entered the room. "It's time." Sophia turned to face him, her eyes sparking with defiance. "You know this is wrong. You realize that, don't you?" Thomas didn't flinch. "It's for your own good, Sophia. You'll see that eventually." Her fists clenched, and she fought the urge to scream at him. There was no point in arguing anymore. She had no choice but to go through with it. But she silently vowed to make him regret this decision. As they made their way downstairs, Sophia's mind was in turmoil. She could already feel the weight of the life she was about to step into. A life with Ethan, a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. It was humiliating. And yet there was no escape. This was her reality now, whether she accepted it or not. Ethan stood by the archway in the garden, looking just as out of place as Sophia felt. He wore a simple suit, his usual rugged appearance softened by the formality of the occasion. But even in his discomfort, there was an air of calm about him, a resigned acceptance that irritated Sophia to no end. How could he just go along with this? The officiant waited patiently, smiling warmly as if this were just another joyful celebration. Sophia had to force herself not to roll her eyes. There was nothing joyful about this moment. She barely heard the words of the ceremony as her mind wandered, desperately searching for a way out of the future being forced upon her. Ethan's voice, steady and calm, broke through her thoughts as he recited his vows. He looked directly at her, and for a moment, Sophia saw something in his eyes that took her by surprise. He wasn't happy about this either. Of course he wasn't. Why would he be? He hadn't asked for this any more than she had. But still he was going through with it, playing his part just as she was. When it was her turn, the words felt foreign, heavy on her tongue. "Ido." She whispered them barely above a breath. And just like that it was over. She was now Mrs. Ethan, whatever his last name was. The reality of the situation hit her. She didn't even know his last name. As the ceremony wrapped up, the small crowd of guests clapped politely, but there was no warmth in the applause.
No celebración.
This was a transaction, nothing more. Sophia's eyes found her father, standing with his arms crossed, a satisfied look on his face. She wanted to scream at him to tell him he had destroyed her life, but all she could manage was a cold, resentful glare. Ethan stepped toward her, offering his arm as they began walking back toward the house. Sophia hesitated for a moment before reluctantly accepting it. The gesture felt stiff and forced, and she couldn't shake the discomfort of it. They walked in silence, neither knowing what to say once they reached the house. Thomas wasted no time in addressing them once they entered. "You'll move into the guest house," he said in his usual businesslike tone. "It's modest, but it'll suit you both." Sophia shot him a venomous look. "Of course it's modest. That's the whole point, isn't it?" Thomas ignored her sarcasm, continuing with his plan. "You'll live there as husband and wife. It's time you learned what real life is like, Sophia." She wanted to argue, to lash out, but the weight of the day had drained her of all her energy. Instead, she nodded, resigned to her fate. Ethan remained silent through the exchange, his face impassive. Sophia couldn't tell what was going through his mind, but by this point she didn't care. She just wanted to be left alone. Without another word, she turned and headed toward the guest house, leaving Ethan and her father behind her. The guest house was small, nowhere near the grandeur of the mansion she had grown up in, but still larger than anything she'd ever lived in outside of her family's estate. She stepped inside and immediately felt the weight of the situation settle over her. This was her new life. No more luxury. No more freedom. Just this small, confining house and Ethan. A few moments later, Ethan followed her in, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't what you wanted." Sophia spun around, her eyes flashing with anger. "What I wanted? None of this is what I wanted." She took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tide of emotion. "But I guess that doesn't matter, does it?" Ethan nodded, his face somber. "I suppose we are." For a long moment they stood in silence, neither knowing how to proceed. The weight of their forced marriage hung thick in the air, and Sophia knew that no matter how much she fought, things would never be the same. The next morning, Sophia woke up with the same feeling of disbelief and anger that had gripped her the day before. The small guest house, with its quaint decor and cozy atmosphere, couldn't have been further from the luxurious mansion she had once known. Gone were the silk sheets and grand windows she'd been accustomed to. Instead, she was surrounded by simple white curtains and a modest bed that creaked whenever she moved. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that this was all just some nightmare. But the sound of clanging dishes from the kitchen reminded her that it wasn't. It was all too real. She was married to Ethan, the gardener, and there was no escaping it. Sighing heavily, she threw the covers off and made her way to the bathroom. Splashing cold water on her face, Sophia caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was messy, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. This wasn't the Sophia Fletcher she knew. The confident, carefree young woman who could have anything she desired with just a snap of her fingers was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone trapped in a life she never asked for. A life that seemed to be slipping away with each passing moment. When she finally stepped out of her bedroom, Ethan was already sitting at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as she entered, offering a quiet, almost hesitant smile. "Morning," he said softly. Sophia didn't respond. Instead, she walked straight to the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. She wasn't in the mood for polite conversation, especially not with the man who was now technically her husband. No matter how nice or considerate Ethan seemed, she hadn't forgotten the situation she was in. She wasn't about to make it any easier for him. "You should eat something," Ethan said, his voice gentle but persistent. "I made eggs." Sophia glanced at the plate of scrambled eggs he'd set on the table. They looked decent enough, but her appetite was non-existent. Instead, she took a long sip of water and then placed the bottle on the counter with a loud thud. "I'm not hungry," she said flatly. Ethan nodded silently, his expression unreadable, and returned to his coffee. The silence between them was thick, uncomfortable, like an invisible weight pressing down on the air. Sophia could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. The tension was unbearable. She had to get out. Without a word, she grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The fresh air hit her face, bringing a fleeting sense of relief, but it wasn't enough to chase away the frustration swirling inside her. The guest house sat at the edge of the sprawling vineyard, the rows of grapevines stretching out for miles. The early morning sun bathed everything in a golden light, casting a beautiful glow over the vineyard and the distant mountains. It should have been peaceful, even calming. But to Sophia, it felt like nothing more than an elaborate backdrop to her misery. She started walking, her steps quick and purposeful, as if putting physical distance between herself and the house could somehow ease the anger gnawing at her insides. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't care. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in that house. Not with Ethan and the suffocating reality of her new life. As she wandered through the vineyard, memories of her former life came rushing back. Shopping in Beverly Hills, extravagant dinners with friends, vacations on private islands. All of it was out of reach now. Her father had ripped it all away, trapping her in this nightmare of a punishment. She kicked the dirt beneath her, sending small pebbles flying into the vines. "This is so stupid," she muttered to herself. "I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be stuck with him." She kept walking, letting the endless rows of vines stretch out around her like a maze of green and gold. But as the sun climbed higher, Sophia knew she couldn't run from the inevitable. Eventually, she would have to go back to the guest house. Ethan would still be there, waiting, calm as ever. The thought of his tranquility infuriated her. How could he just accept this situation? By the time she returned to the guest house, the kitchen was empty. Ethan had already cleaned up the breakfast dishes and disappeared, probably out in the garden working. Sophia felt a flicker of guilt for not acknowledging his effort to be kind, but she quickly dismissed it. This wasn't about kindness. Her life had been turned upside down, and no amount of scrambled eggs was going to make it right. She wandered into the living room and sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, the hours dragging by. What was she supposed to do now? There were no more parties, no more shopping sprees. The life of luxury she had once taken for granted was gone, and the weight of it all sank deeper with every passing minute. As the sun began to set, she heard the door creak open. Ethan stepped inside, his face flushed from a long day's work in the garden. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at Sophia, his eyes searching her face, though she wasn't sure what for. After a moment he spoke. "I'm going to make dinner," he said. "You're welcome to join me." Sophia didn't respond. She just stared at him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Ethan waited a beat, then turned and walked toward the kitchen without saying another word. The clatter of pots and pans filled the silence, and for a moment, Sophia considered leaving again just to escape the tension between them. But something, she wasn't sure what, kept her rooted to the spot. As she sat there, listening to the familiar sounds of cooking, Sophia realized something. Ethan wasn't fighting her. He wasn't pushing back against her anger or resentment. Instead, he seemed to be giving her space, allowing her to process everything at her own pace. It was frustrating, confusing, and at the same time there was something strangely comforting about it. Still, Sophia wasn't ready to soften. Not yet. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not when she was determined to make this as difficult as possible. If her father thought she would just accept this marriage and move on, he was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning, Sophia woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a stark contrast to the hum of traffic and city noise she was used to. For a brief second, she almost forgot where she was. But then reality hit her like a punch to the gut. She was still in the guest house. Still trapped in this forced marriage with Ethan. And nothing had changed. With a sigh, she sat up, brushing her hair out of her face. Through the small window, she could see Ethan already hard at work in the garden. Bent over a bed of flowers, he carefully tended to each plant with the same precision he applied to everything. Even from a distance, she could see the concentration etched into his face, as though the rest of the world faded away when he worked. Sophia stood up and moved toward the window, watching him for a moment. She had never understood people like Ethan, people who found satisfaction in such simple things. To her, life had always been about fast cars, luxurious hotels, and exclusive parties. But to Ethan, it seemed that a day spent in the garden was enough. It didn't make sense to her, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a strange curiosity. What was it like, Sophia wondered, to live a life where nothing felt rushed? A life where everything seemed to follow its own natural rhythm, where satisfaction came from the earth beneath your feet and the effort you put into it. Shaking her head, she turned away from the window, dismissing the thought. She wasn't interested in understanding Ethan or his simple lifestyle. She was only waiting for the chance to leave, to return to her real life, her real world. But that opportunity didn't seem to be arriving anytime soon. Later that day, as Sophia roamed the estate, she found herself wandering into the garden where Ethan was working. She had no intention of engaging with him, but the sight of him among the plants, moving with a quiet sort of grace, caught her attention. She kept her distance, standing at the edge of the garden, observing him as he moved from one flower bed to the next. His hands worked swiftly and skillfully, pruning and shaping the greenery with a kind of care that made Sophia pause. Ethan's focus was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't the relentless drive for success or the cutthroat ambition that had filled her father's world: business deals, high-stakes negotiations, the endless pursuit of more. No, this was something different. It was slower, more deliberate, and curiously peaceful. As she watched him, Sophia noticed something she hadn't expected. There was no frustration in Ethan's movements. No sense of urgency or rush to finish the task. Each action was purposeful, as though he found joy not just in the end result, but in the process itself. Every now and then, he would pause to wipe the sweat from his brow or carefully examine a plant, as if nothing existed outside the boundaries of the garden. Despite herself, Sophia found it oddly calming, this way of working. She still didn't understand how he could be content with such a simple life, but there was something in the rhythm of his movements that drew her in, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. After a while, Ethan seemed to sense her presence. He looked up, catching her eye from across the garden. Straightening up, he brushed the dirt from his hands and offered her a small smile. "Hey," he said, walking over to her. "I didn't think you'd be out here." Sophia shrugged, crossing her arms over her chest. "I didn't have anything better to do." Ethan nodded, glancing back at the garden. "I guess that's fair. It's not exactly exciting around here, but it's peaceful." "Peaceful?" Sophia echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Is that really all you want? Just peace?" Ethan tilted his head, considering her words. "I guess so. I've never really wanted more than that." Sophia stared at him, incredulous. "You've never wanted anything more?"
No ambitions, no dreams?
Ethan smiled, but there was something deeper in his eyes. Something that Sophia couldn't quite place. "Ambition's not really my thing. I like knowing that I can wake up every day and do something I love. There's something satisfying about watching something grow, knowing you played a part in making it happen." Sophia frowned, unable to understand how someone could be content with so little. But then again, Ethan didn't seem the type to chase wealth or status. He was different. "You don't get bored?" she asked, genuinely curious. Ethan chuckled softly. "Not really. There's always something to do, something to fix, something to grow. It's never boring when you appreciate the little things." Sophia didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure how to process what Ethan was saying. The little things. She'd never cared about those. Life had always been about the big moments: luxury, excitement, extravagance. But as she stood there, watching Ethan talk about the garden, she realized maybe she had been missing something. Not that she was ready to admit it. Not yet, anyway. "Well, good for you, I guess," Sophia muttered, brushing off the thought. "But I still think it's ridiculous." Ethan just smiled, unfazed by her dismissal. "You don't have to understand it, Sophia. It's just who I am." A long silence followed, the only sound the gentle rustling of the wind through the grapevines. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on her, like a blanket she didn't want but couldn't shake off. "You should try it sometime," Ethan said after a beat, his voice light but sincere. "You might be surprised." Sophia scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Yeah, right. Me? Gardening? Not going to happen." Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "Suit yourself." With that, he turned and went back to his work, leaving Sophia standing there once again. She watched him for a moment, feeling a strange stir of emotion she couldn't quite understand. A mixture of confusion and curiosity. She didn't get Ethan, and part of her didn't want to. But there was another part of her, a small part, that wondered if maybe there was something to learn from him. She quickly pushed the thought aside. She wasn't about to fall for the simplicity of Ethan's life. She had a world waiting for her. A world of luxury, excitement, and power. This was temporary. It had to be. But as she turned to walk back to the guest house, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, catching one last look at Ethan. And for a brief moment, she felt a tug in her chest. Something deep inside her that she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Days passed in the small guest house, and Sophia found herself slipping into a routine that was strange, yet oddly comforting. She still felt trapped by her circumstances, still resented the situation her father had thrust upon her. But something was shifting slowly against her will. She began to notice things she had never cared about before. It started with the mornings. Sophia would wake up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight spilling through the thin curtains of the guest house. At first, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, dreading the day ahead. But over time she began to listen, to the breeze rustling the leaves of the vineyard, to the quiet hum of life outside her walls. Ethan was always up before her, already working in the garden or doing something around the estate. His quiet presence was as steady as the sunrise. Though Sophia had once resented his calm demeanor, she now found it oddly reassuring. He never pushed her. He never demanded anything from her. He was just there. Of course, Sophia still kept her distance. She wasn't about to embrace this new life, or fall into some romantic idea with the gardener. But she couldn't deny that something had changed. One morning, as she stood by the window, watching Ethan work in the garden, Sophia found herself unexpectedly feeling a bit of admiration. He moved through the plants with an effortless grace, his hands tending to them with a familiarity that suggested he had an almost personal connection with each one. There was a rhythm to his movements, a quiet confidence that came from years of practice, and despite herself, Sophia couldn't help but respect it. The change was subtle but undeniable. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started, but gradually, she realized she was noticing things she'd never cared about before. The vibrant colors of the flowers, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and the gentle sound of the wind rustling through the vineyard, all of it felt new to her. These were things she had overlooked in her old life, where everything had been about rushing through each moment, always seeking the next indulgence. Here, though, in this peaceful corner of the world, time seemed to slow down, and for the first time Sophia found herself wondering if that was such a bad thing. One afternoon, as she sat outside reading a book, Ethan walked over, a basket of fresh vegetables in his hands. His shirt was stained with dirt from the day's work. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, nodding toward the empty chair beside her. Sophia shrugged without lifting her eyes from her book. "Do whatever you want." Ethan smiled faintly and took a seat, sitting quietly for a few moments. There was no conversation between them, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable, just a bit distant. It wasn't awkward exactly, but it wasn't exactly cozy either. It was somewhere in between, familiar yet distant, like the kind of quiet you share with someone you know well, but don't really know at all. After a while, Ethan broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice casual, "about you being here, about how things are." Sophia glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, and what have you been thinking?" Ethan didn't meet her gaze. Instead, his attention stayed on the basket of vegetables in front of him, his fingers absently fiddling with a stalk of celery. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I get it. But, I don't know, it doesn't have to be that bad, does it?" Sophia scoffed, feeling the usual defensiveness bubble up inside her. "Ethan, I'm living in a guest house on my father's estate, married to someone I barely know because I had no choice. You really think this isn't so bad?" Ethan let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm not saying it's ideal, but you've been here a while now. You've seen how things are. Maybe it's not what you're used to, but it's not the worst, right?" For a moment, Sophia didn't answer. She wanted to argue, to point out how ridiculous it was to even suggest her situation wasn't awful, but the words didn't come. Deep down, she wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure how to feel about anything. Ethan must have sensed her hesitation because he continued, "I'm not asking you to love it here. I just think maybe there's something worth appreciating, something small. You know?" Sophia rolled her eyes, but there was no real sting behind it. "What?" Like gardening? Is that what you're trying to get at? Ethan smiled again, this time a little more genuinely. Maybe. You might be surprised. You're always welcome to join me. Sophia shook her head, but a small involuntary smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Yeah, I don't think so. They sat in silence for a while longer, the conversation fading as the day started to cool. Sophia watched the sun dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the vineyard. There was something soothing about the way the light filtered through the trees, how the air seemed to settle into a gentle hum as evening approached. For the first time in a while, Sophia didn't feel the need to leave. She was still angry at her father, still frustrated with her situation, but something inside her had shifted. She was starting to see things differently, to notice the beauty in moments she had once dismissed. She glanced over at Ethan, who was quietly watching the sunset, his face relaxed with contentment. There was something about him that made her pause, something she couldn't quite name. He wasn't like anyone she had ever known. He didn't care about wealth or status. He cared about simple things, things Sophia had never really thought twice about. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to that. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, Sophia stood and stretched her arms above her head. I'm going inside, she said casually. Ethan nodded, his gaze still on the horizon. All right. See you later. As she made her way back to the guest house, Sophia realized she didn't hate being here quite as much as she once had. It wasn't perfect, and she still wasn't sure what her future held. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely lost. There was something calm about this place. And maybe, just maybe, there was something peaceful about Ethan too. The days began to blend together as Sophia continued to settle into the quiet solitude of the guest house. Her mornings were filled with the sounds of birds and the gentle rustling of vineyard leaves. Ethan's steady presence had become something she relied on, like the sunrise or the warm breeze that passed through the fields in the afternoon. But despite the peace around her, inside Sophia was still a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't deny the changes she felt, though she resented how her anger, which had once been a driving force, seemed to be fading. She hated that. It had been her fuel, giving her purpose, but now she found herself questioning everything. What was she still angry about? Her father's manipulation, sure. That part hadn't changed. But her life here with Ethan? It was becoming harder to hate. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with her legs curled beneath her, Sophia stared out at the vineyard, the warmth of the sun on her skin doing little to ease the heaviness of her thoughts. She hated that she no longer had an easy answer. Before, it had been simple. She resented Ethan, her father, and the situation as a whole. But now there were moments when she found herself not exactly happy, but at peace. And that scared her more than anything. Ethan was out working as usual, and Sophia found herself watching him more and more. Not in a romantic way, at least not yet, but with a kind of curiosity. He was so steady, so content with the life he had built. Even though it was small and simple. It was everything she had once scorned. But now she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than all the things she had spent years chasing. Her mind wandered back to that conversation they'd had a few days ago, when Ethan had suggested that she might find something here worth appreciating. At the time she had brushed it off with a scoff, but now she wasn't so sure. Maybe he had been right. Perhaps there was something to be learned from this life. But accepting that thought only brought a whole new set of questions. If she admitted that there was value in the simplicity of it all, what did that say about who she had been before? Had her entire life up to this point been shallow and meaningless? Sophia shook her head, trying to push those thoughts aside. She wasn't ready to dive into that kind of self-reflection. She had spent so long building her identity around luxury, status, and living for the finer things. And now here she was, sitting in a modest guest house, questioning whether those things even mattered as much as she had always believed. As the hours passed, Sophia found herself unable to stay still, so she wandered outside again. She walked slowly through the vineyard, letting her fingers trail over the grapevines as she moved. The air had cooled, and the sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rows of plants. It was beautiful, in a way that felt unfamiliar to her. When she reached the edge of the property, she saw Ethan sitting on a small stone wall, his hands resting in his lap as he stared out across the vineyard. He looked deep in thought, and for a moment Sophia hesitated. She wasn't sure what had drawn her here, or what she was supposed to say now that she was standing in front of him. "Hey," she said softly, taking a step closer. Ethan looked up, surprised to see her there. "Hey," he replied, offering her a small smile. "Everything okay?" Sophia shrugged, unsure of how to answer. "I guess I just needed to get out of the house." Ethan nodded and scooted over on the wall to make room for her. "Sit," he said, offering her a space beside him. She hesitated but eventually sat down next to him, the silence settling in between them. They sat there for a while, the only sounds being the soft rustling of the vines and the distant chirping of crickets. It was peaceful, but Sophia's mind was anything but calm. Finally, she broke the silence. "I don't get you," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Ethan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't get how you can be so okay with all of this," Sophia explained, waving a hand around at the vineyard. "This life, it's so small. Don't you ever want more?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, taking time to consider her question. "I think it depends on what you mean by more," he said finally. "I mean bigger, better," she answered, her frustration creeping into her voice. "More excitement, more success, more money. You're content with so little." "How?" Ethan smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that caught Sophia off guard. "I guess it comes down to what you value. For me, it's not about money or excitement. It's about the work. About knowing that I'm creating something, growing something. That's enough for me." Sophia shook her head, unable to fully grasp his perspective. "But don't you feel like you're missing out?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Maybe to some people it might seem like I am. But I've never felt that way." He paused before continuing. "I think people get so caught up in chasing more that they forget to appreciate what they already have." His words hit Sophia harder than she expected. She realized then how much of her life had been spent chasing more. More money, more status, more attention. And now here she was, sitting with someone who had so much less, yet seemed so much more content. It made her question everything she thought she knew. "I don't know if I can be like that," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I've always needed more." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about being like me, Sophia. It's about figuring out what makes you happy, what really matters to you." Sophia didn't respond. She didn't know how to. For the first time, she realized she had no answer to that question. She had spent so much time chasing things that didn't really matter. And now, having to face that truth left her feeling empty. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting the vineyard in a warm golden light, Sophia felt something inside her shift. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, but she could feel her old life starting to blur. And as much as she hated it, there was a small part of her beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Ethan was onto something. Later, Sophia paced around the small living room of the guest house, her heart racing in her chest. She hadn't felt this kind of anxious energy in weeks, not since the day of the wedding. But today was different. Today she was going to confront her father. The idea had been slowly taking shape in her mind for days, ever since that conversation with Ethan by the vineyard. Something had shifted inside her, and while she didn't fully understand what it meant, one thing was clear. She could no longer keep living under her father's control. The thought of facing him filled her with both dread and determination. Thomas Fletcher had always been larger than life, a man whose presence dominated every room he entered. Growing up, Sophia had quickly learned that defying him had consequences, and this marriage had been the ultimate proof of that. But now, standing in the quiet of the guest house, Sophia felt a surge of strength she had never felt before. She was tired of living by his rules, tired of letting him dictate every aspect of her life. She glanced out the window at the vineyard where Ethan was working, just as he always did. There was something grounding about his steady presence, even from a distance. Sophia knew she didn't have to do this, but if she didn't confront her father now, she might never get the chance to break free. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her jacket and stepped outside. The path to the main house seemed longer than usual, the vineyard stretching out like an endless maze of green and gold. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking toward a final confrontation that had been building for years. When she reached the front door of the mansion, she paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The memories of her old life rushed back, almost like echoes of a time she no longer recognized. The extravagant parties, the designer clothes, the constant hum of power and privilege. Back then it had all felt vital. But now it seemed like a different world entirely, A world that had faded into something distant and almost foreign. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and pushed open the door. Inside, the grand foyer was exactly as she remembered it, cold and imposing. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's light, but the place had no soul. It was nothing more than a monument to her father's wealth, a cold reminder of what he had achieved and the price he demanded for it. Thomas was in his office, of course, the room where he spent nearly all of his time these days. She could hear his voice faintly through the door, the distant sound of business calls that never seemed to stop. Probably on another one of his calls, she thought. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should wait. But then she straightened her back and shook off the thought. No more waiting. No more deferring to him. Without another second of hesitation, she knocked once, then swung the door open, stepping inside before he could even acknowledge her presence. Thomas looked up, startled by the interruption. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, his phone in one hand, paper scattered around him in his usual chaotic manner. The moment he saw her, his face tightened, his irritation unmistakable. "Sophia," he snapped, his voice sharper than she expected. "I'm on a call. This better be important." She crossed her arms and stood firm, her eyes locking with his. "It is." He held up a finger, gesturing for her to wait while he finished his call. Sophia didn't flinch. She stood there staring at him, her jaw tight as he continued barking orders into the phone. It was all so familiar, the image of her father, the businessman who was always in control. But today things were different. Today she wasn't going to let him brush her off. Finally, Thomas slammed the phone down with an abrupt click, the sound of it filling the room. He leaned back in his chair, giving her a long, assessing look that was equal parts annoyance and curiosity. "What is it you want, Sophia?" he asked, his voice oozing impatience.
I'm Busse.
She didn't waver. "We need to talk about the wedding. About this whole arrangement." For the first time, she saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes, though it quickly vanished. "Oh, is my daughter finally having a change of heart? Ready to beg for an annulment?" Sophia shook her head, keeping her voice steady. "No, that's not why I'm here." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Then what? You've been holed up in the guest house for weeks now. Surely you're not enjoying it." "I'm not here to discuss what I enjoy," she said, forcing the words out. "I'm here to tell you I'm done being controlled by you. You thought forcing me into this marriage would teach me a lesson. Well, it didn't. It didn't work." Thomas's face darkened, but he didn't speak, letting her continue. Taking a step closer, Sophia felt a surge of strength rise inside her, a strength she hadn't known she possessed before. "You thought this marriage was a punishment. But it's not. I've learned more about myself in the last few weeks than I ever did under your thumb. And I'm not going to let you run my life anymore." Thomas stood, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "Is that so? And what do you think you're going to do about it? Run off with the gardener and live happily ever after?" Sophia met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Maybe I will. And if I do, it will be my choice, not yours." Thomas's eyes flashed with barely contained fury. His jaw clenched. "You're being absurd. Do you really think you can throw away everything I've given you? Everything this family has worked for?" Sophia didn't flinch. "It's not your life to control, Dad. It's mine." The silence that followed was thick with tension, neither of them willing to give in. Sophia could see the internal conflict in his eyes, the battle between his need to control her and the reality that he was losing his grip. "You've always been stubborn," Thomas said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "But don't forget who you're talking to. I'm the one who made this family what it is. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me." Sophia shook her head, the words coming out with more force than she intended. "You gave me everything except the one thing I wanted, my freedom." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophia could see something shift in her father's expression. It wasn't anger, nor was it disappointment. It was something more elusive, something closer to regret. But Thomas was a man who never admitted defeat, and he straightened his shoulders, his voice icy and calculated once more. "So you want your freedom, do you?" he asked coldly. "Fine. But don't come crawling back to me when you realize the world out there isn't as easy as you think." Sophia nodded, her heart still pounding, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. I won't. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving him standing there. The door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation had been intense, but it was over. She had said what she needed to say. And as she walked away, Sophia finally felt like she was in control of her own life again. After this exchange, Sophia felt a mix of emotions: anger, relief, and a strange sense of freedom she hadn't expected. For the first time in her life, she had stood up to her father. Though the conversation had been uncomfortable and tense, it also marked a turning point. She wasn't sure where to go from here, but she was certain of one thing. She wouldn't return to the life of luxury and control that her father had carved out for her. When she arrived back at the guest house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in rich golden hues. Ethan was outside, kneeling by the flower beds, his hands covered in dirt as he worked with an intensity that was almost calming. Sophia watched him from a distance, a sense of peace washing over her. It had been weeks since the wedding, and while things had been awkward at first, something had shifted between them. Ethan's quiet patience and unspoken resilience had caught Sophia off guard, and over time, she'd come to appreciate the simple kindness he offered her. He never pushed her, never expected anything in return. And now, after the confrontation with her father, she found herself drawn to the steady calmness Ethan seemed to embody. As she approached, Ethan looked up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're back," he said softly, his voice warm but unhurried. "How did it go?" Sophia sat down on the small stone bench by the garden, exhaling deeply. "It was intense," she confessed, "but I finally said what I needed to." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful as he moved to sit next to her. "Good. It's about time." Sophia gave a faint smile and glanced at him. "You think so?" "Yeah," Ethan said gently but with a quiet conviction. "You've been holding that in for too long. It's good that you finally let it out." Leaning back, Sophia stared up at the sky as it shifted from a rich orange to soft pink. "I just don't know what comes next," she murmured. "I feel like I'm floating between two worlds. The life I had before and this one. I don't know where I belong anymore." Ethan was silent for a beat before he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Maybe you don't need to choose right now," he said. "Maybe you can just be." She turned to look at him, surprised by the simplicity of his response. "Just be?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. Life doesn't always have to be about making big decisions or figuring everything out in one go. Sometimes it's enough to just live. Let it unfold." Sophia sat with that thought for a moment, letting it sink in. She realized that her entire life had been driven by urgency, a constant need to plan, control, and anticipate what was coming next. But maybe, just maybe, Ethan was right. Maybe she didn't need to have everything figured out right now. "I'm not used to that," she admitted, her voice softening. "I've always had a plan. Even when I was pushing against my father's control, I was still chasing something." Ethan leaned back on the bench, his arm brushing hers as they sat in comfortable silence. "I get that," he said. "But plans change. People change." Sophia glanced at him, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. His words seemed to echo something inside her, a quiet truth she hadn't been ready to face. Over the past few weeks, she had started seeing Ethan in a new light, not just as the man her father had forced her to marry, but as someone steady, kind, and patient. Everything she hadn't realized she needed. As she allowed herself to really look at him, Sophia realized how handsome Ethan was, though in a rugged, understated way. His strong jawline, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was also different from what she had known before. More than that, there was something about him, an inherent warmth, a quiet strength, that she had come to rely on without even realizing it. She shifted, turning the conversation back to him. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you have a plan?" Ethan chuckled softly and shook his head. "I've never been one for plans," he said. "I like things simple. I take life as it comes." Sophia smiled, her heart fluttering unexpectedly. "That sounds nice." Ethan met her gaze, his expression softening. "Can be." The air between them shifted, something unspoken hanging in the quiet, and for a moment, Sophia felt as though the world around them had paused. She hadn't planned on feeling anything for Ethan, but sitting beside him, With the warmth of the setting sun and the quiet peace of the vineyard around them, she couldn't ignore the way her heart raced when he looked at her. Ethan, she began, her voice hesitant. About this marriage. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. I know we didn't have a choice, Sophia said, her words deliberate, and I know things haven't exactly been ideal, but I think… She paused, searching for the right words. I think I'm starting to see things differently. Ethan said nothing, but the way he looked at her made her feel like he already understood what she was trying to say. Taking a deep breath, Sophia's pulse quickened. I guess what I'm trying to say is maybe this doesn't have to be a punishment. Maybe we can make it something more. Ethan's expression softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustling of the vines in the evening breeze. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand in his touch warm, steady, and sure. Is that what you want? He asked quietly. Sophia nodded, her heart racing. Yeah, I think it is. Ethan's smile was small but sincere, and he squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll figure it out together. The simplicity of his words filled Sophia with a peace she hadn't known in years. There were still so many unknowns ahead, so many things she didn't have figured out, but for the first time in a long time that didn't scare her. She wasn't alone in this anymore. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the deepening sky, Sophia felt a warmth bloom inside her. One that had nothing to do with wealth, status, or anything she had chased before. This was something different. This was real. And for the first time she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days following her conversation with Ethan were filled with clarity, though still tinged with a quiet hesitation. She had finally admitted to herself that her feelings for him were real, that maybe this forced marriage didn't have to be the burden she had once thought it was. But that realization also carried with it the weight of a decision that would alter everything. Sophia knew the time had come to make things official. She wanted to stand before Ethan, not as two people trapped in a marriage imposed by her father, but as partners, as equals. It wasn't something she had ever expected for herself, but now it was everything she wanted. One morning, as the sun stretched its first golden rays over the vineyard, Sophia sat quietly on the porch of the guest house, lost in thought. The warm cup of coffee she cradled between her hands was a small comfort, the heat seeping into her skin as the world slowly came to life around her. The vineyard, which had once symbolized the confinement she had felt, now felt like home. The peace, the simplicity. It had all grown on her in ways she never expected. But she couldn't stay in this state of limbo forever. She had to take control of her life, make the choice that she had been putting off for so long. Her father had pushed her into this marriage to teach her a lesson, but now it was her turn to decide what came next. Stay or leave. That afternoon, she found Ethan working in the garden, as he always did. He was kneeling by a flower bed, his hands carefully tending to the plants with the same calm attention he always gave them. There was something deeply reassuring about the way he worked, something that helped ground her even as her mind raced. Ethan, she called softly, stepping closer. He looked up, surprised but not startled, and wiped his hands on his jeans. Hey, he said, standing up. Everything okay? Sophia nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. I need to talk to you. Ethan's expression shifted, curiosity and concern flickering in his eyes. Sure. What's on your mind? Taking a deep breath, Sophia tried to steady herself. Being vulnerable wasn't easy for her. But with Ethan it felt different. Felt safe. I've been thinking, she began, her voice quieter than she intended. About us. About everything that's happened. Since the wedding. Ethan said nothing, just let her speak, giving her the space she needed. I know we didn't have a choice in this, Sophia continued, her hands fidgeting nervously. I know my father forced both of us into this, and at first I hated it. I hated you. I hated this place. I hated everything. Ethan gave a small, understanding smile, but he didn't interrupt. But now, Sophia went on, her voice gaining a little strength, things are different. I don't feel trapped anymore. I don't feel like this is some kind of punishment. In fact, I think I might actually be happy here. Her words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning, and Ethan stepped a little closer to her. His voice was soft but full of warmth. What are you saying, Sophia? She looked down at the ground, gathering her thoughts. I'm saying I want this. I want to be here with you. Not because my father forced me into it, but because it's what I choose. For a moment, Ethan's face was unreadable, as if he was trying to process everything she just said. Then slowly, a genuine smile spread across his face, and Sophia felt a flutter in her chest. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with disbelief and hope. Sophia nodded, the peace inside her growing stronger. "Yeah, I'm serious." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, he reached out and pulled her into a tight hug. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against hers. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia laughed softly, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Neither did I." They stood there for what felt like a long time, the world around them quiet and still for the first time in what felt like forever. Sophia felt a deep sense of peace. There was no anger, no resentment. Just the quiet, shared understanding that this was where she was meant to be. Eventually, Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "So what does this mean?" he asked, his tone filled with curiosity. Sophia smiled, a feeling of excitement building inside her. "It means I want to make this real. I want to renew our vows on our terms this time." Ethan blinked, clearly surprised. "You mean?" Sophia nodded, her smile widening. "Yeah, I want to marry you. For real." For a moment, Ethan was speechless, his eyes searching hers as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, without warning, a huge grin spread across his face, and he lifted her off the ground, spinning her in a circle. Sophia laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, Ethan looked at her with an expression of pure joy, one she had never seen before. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice full of emotion. Sophia smiled, her heart full of warmth. "Just say yes." Ethan laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes, absolutely yes." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, with the vineyard stretching out around them like a quiet witness to the moment. It was simple, but it felt perfect. And for the first time, Sophia didn't feel like she was chasing something. She had found exactly what she needed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden glow over the vineyard, they walked hand in hand back to the guest house. They talked about the future in a way they never had before. It was different now. It was real. And when they reached the porch, Sophia stopped and turned to Ethan with a smile that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside her. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "Let's do it tomorrow." Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with happiness. "Tomorrow." They stood there for a moment, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. And in that moment, Sophia knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice. The day after Sophia made her decision felt like the beginning of a new chapter. But not everyone was as happy about it as she was. Thomas Fletcher, who had always prided himself on being in control, was struggling to accept that his power and influence might not be enough to control everything, including his daughter's life. The events of the past few weeks had shaken his sense of authority, and now for the first time, he was faced with the reality that he might have lost control completely. Thomas sat at his desk in his office, surrounded by the familiar symbols of his wealth and power, unaware that things were about to change in ways he never imagined. The polished wood of Thomas's desk gleamed beneath the soft light of the chandelier, the rich scent of leather and old money filling the air. His office had always radiated power, a space that made him feel untouchable, in control. But today, the usual comfort it offered him was absent. All he could feel was unease. He had been avoiding thinking about Sophia ever since their confrontation. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but the doubt that had started creeping into his mind was now impossible to ignore. He told himself that she was just being stubborn, that she would eventually come to her senses and beg for his forgiveness. But as the days passed and he heard nothing from her, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was different. He couldn't understand why she wasn't fighting harder to escape the life he had forced upon her. She had always rebelled in the past. He had expected her to come crawling back, desperate to be freed from the marriage to Ethan. Instead, she had done the opposite. She had stayed. And now, rumors had reached him that she was planning to renew her vows with Ethan, of her own accord. The thought of it sent a hot flare of anger through him. How could his daughter, his only child, choose a life that was so beneath her? How could she turn her back on everything he had built for her? Thomas stood abruptly, gripping the edge of his desk as he stared out the window at the vineyard below. The rows of grapevines, once a symbol of his success, now seemed like a prison. It was the place where Sophia had slipped from his grasp, where his plans for her future had unraveled. He had given her everything: money, opportunities, education, and yet none of it had worked. She was slipping further away, choosing a life that in his eyes felt like a betrayal. His thoughts were broken by the creak of the office door. Thomas turned sharply to see his assistant Lily standing in the doorway, her expression cautious. "Mr. Fletcher," she began hesitantly. "Your daughter is here to see you." Thomas's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked his emotions. "Send her in," he said, his voice as cold and commanding as ever. Lily nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Moments later, Sophia stepped into the office. There was something different about her today. She looked more confident, more at ease with herself than Thomas had ever seen her. The change unsettled him. "Sophia," Thomas said, his voice tight. "What is this about?" Sophia took a deep breath, standing tall in front of him. "I'm here to tell you that I'm renewing my vows with Ethan." Thomas's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "So I've heard. And what exactly do you expect me to say to that?" "I'm not here to ask for your permission," Sophia replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm here to tell you because I think you deserve to know. But this is my life now, and I'm choosing how to live it." Thomas's eyes narrowed, his temper flaring. "You're choosing to throw everything away? Is that what you're telling me?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Sophia said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm choosing a life that makes me happy. A life where I get to be myself." Thomas's face reddened, his voice rising. "And what about the life I built for you? The wealth, the opportunities, everything I've worked for. Are you just going to walk away from all of it?" Sophia met his gaze without flinching. "You built that life for yourself, Dad. Not for me. I never asked for any of it." Her words hit Thomas like a slap across the face. He had always believed that everything he did, every sacrifice he made, was for Sophia's benefit. He had worked so hard to provide her with the best, to ensure her future was secure. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that he had never truly considered what she wanted. It had always been about what he thought was best for her, not what she desired. Thomas's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. "You're making a mistake, Sophia. Ethan is beneath you. He'll never be able to give you the life you deserve." Sophia shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "That's where you're wrong. Ethan is exactly what I need. He's kind, he's steady, and he loves me for who I am, not for what I have." Thomas's fists clenched at his sides. "You think love is enough? You think you can live on love alone? You're being naive, Sophia." "I'm being happy," she shot back, her voice filled with more confidence than Thomas had ever heard from her. "And I'm not going to let you take that away from me." The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension between them palpable. Thomas stared at his daughter, his mind racing. For years he had controlled her life, shaped it into what he thought was best. But now, for the first time, he saw that control slipping through his fingers. And for the first time he felt something unfamiliar, something he wasn't accustomed to feeling. Fear. Fear that he had lost her for good. Sophia took a step toward the door, her voice softening just slightly. "I love you, Dad. I always will. But I need to live my own life now. And I hope one day you'll understand that." Thomas didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, his mind a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and regret. As Sophia turned and walked out of the office, the door closing softly behind her, Thomas was left standing in the quiet. The weight of his actions finally started to catch up with him. He had tried to control every aspect of Sophia's life, but in doing so he had pushed her away. And now she was gone, choosing a life that had nothing to do with the world he had built for her. Thomas sank into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty space where his daughter had stood. For the first time he realized there were things he couldn't control. And the price of that realization was Sophia. The day that Sophia had been waiting for arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. The sun was just beginning to rise over the vineyard, casting a warm golden light over the rows of grapevines. The air was cool and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. This time everything felt different. Back when she had married Ethan, it had felt like a punishment, an imposition of her father's will. But today everything had changed. Today it felt like freedom. Today she was making a choice entirely her own. Standing in front of the modest mirror in the guest house, she adjusted the simple white dress she had selected for this special day. It wasn't the lavish, extravagant gown she might have once imagined for herself, but it was perfect. It was a true reflection of the life she was about to embrace. A life not defined by wealth or status, but by love and authenticity. Sophia inhaled deeply, her heart racing with anticipation. It had been a long time since she'd felt this kind of excitement. The past few weeks had been full of self-reflection, realizations, and personal growth. She had finally accepted that the life she once thought she wanted wasn't the life she actually needed. Ethan had helped her see this, not by pressuring her to change, but by simply being himself. A steady, kind presence that showed her happiness could be found in the simplest of moments. A knock on the door brought her back to the present. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, dressed in a neat suit, his hair combed perfectly. He looked at her with the same calm, loving expression he always had. But today there was something else in his eyes. Something deeper. Something more certain. "You look beautiful," Ethan said softly, his smile warm and sincere. Sophia felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she responded quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You look pretty good yourself." They stood there for a moment just taking each other in. The weight of everything they had been through settled between them, like a shared secret. This wasn't just a vow renewal. This was the start of something new, something they were choosing together. "Ready?" Ethan asked, holding out his hand. Sophia nodded, slipping her hand into his, more certain than ever. Together, they walked toward the small clearing in the vineyard where their ceremony would take place. It was a simple setting. A few chairs, a wooden arch adorned with wildflowers, and rows of grapevines stretching into the distance. The air smelled of blooming flowers and fresh earth, while the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze was the only sound accompanying their steps. There were no guests, no extravagant celebration, just the two of them side by side, ready to make this commitment on their own terms. For the first time in her life, Sophia didn't care that there was no crowd or grand spectacle. This was exactly what she wanted. Something real. Something true. The officiant, a kind woman from the nearby town, smiled as they approached. "Shall we begin?" she asked gently. Sophia and Ethan exchanged a glance, both smiling. "Let's do it," Sophia said, her heart swelling with a mix of excitement and peace as the officiant began speaking. A wave of emotion washed over Sophia. She glanced at Ethan, who was looking at her with that same steady gaze, and realized how much they had both changed since the day they first married. Back then they had been strangers, two people thrown together into a situation neither had wanted. But now they were something more, partners, equals, bound not by obligation but by choice. When it was time for the vows, Sophia took a deep breath, her heart racing in her chest. The words she had prepared didn't feel quite enough. But she knew the most important thing was the truth behind them. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but steady. "When we first got married, I didn't truly understand what love was. I didn't know what it meant to be truly happy. I thought happiness came from chasing things, wealth, status, approval. But you taught me that happiness isn't about what we have. It's about who we share our lives with. You've shown me more about love, kindness, and patience than I ever thought possible. And today I choose you not because I have to, but because I want to. I choose you to be my partner, my friend, and my love for the rest of my life." Ethan smiled, his eyes sparkling with emotion as it was his turn to speak. His voice was steady, but there was a tenderness in it that made Sophia's heart ache in the best possible way. "Sophia," he said, his gaze fixed on hers. "I never expected this. I never expected to find someone like you, especially not in the way we did. But from the moment we started this journey together, I knew there was something special about you. You're strong, determined, and so full of life. And every day, you've shown me that love isn't about grand gestures or fancy things. It's about the small, quiet moments, just being together. I choose you, Sophia. I choose you today, tomorrow, and every day after that. And I'm so lucky to be standing here with you, knowing that this is only the beginning of our story." Sophia's eyes filled with tears as the officiant smiled and pronounced them husband and wife. Once again. There was no applause, no cheering crowd, but it didn't matter. This moment was perfect exactly as it was. Ethan leaned in and kissed her gently, and Sophia felt a deep sense of completion wash over her. This was her life now, a life she had chosen not based on what it looked like to others, but based on what it felt like to her. As they walked hand in hand through the vineyard, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows on the ground, Sophia looked up at Ethan, her heart full of love and gratitude. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Ethan smiled and wrapped his arm around her waist. "Neither did I." They walked in peaceful silence for a while, the quiet sounds of the vineyard surrounding them. Words weren't necessary. They both knew what this day meant. A fresh start, a new beginning, and the promise of a future filled with love, joy, and the simple beauty of life together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia looked out at the vineyard, feeling the warmth of Ethan's hand in hers, and smiled, the first real smile she'd ever had. She was exactly where she was meant to be.